I love being in the world, and I like the experience of being alive and being human. I know that sounds funny, but what I mean by that is the idea that there is this sense of possibility that's imbued with being human. And we tend to kind of cover that possibility up by obsessing about problems that we can't really fix, can't really necessarily do anything about, but yet we kind of constantly regurgitate them in our minds that keep ourselves really sort of stuck in these patterns of thinking, patterns of believing, patterns of wanting, patterns of needing, constantly always looking for something out there to try to make the things in here feel better. And what that does is it kind of tells us, I think, in our heart somewhere that we're not quite good enough. We need something else, that we're not quite good enough. I believe that we start to lose ourselves when we keep denying ourselves in that way. And we lose contact, in particular, with the most sensitive and genuine, delicate part of ourselves. That's what we call the heart, you know? But is it a heart? It's the sense in the middle of our being that we have to protect something. We have to protect what's vulnerable. And there was a time in our history, human history, when we very much needed to have that concern. We could have been punctured by any number of animals or situations in the world that we lived in at that time. There was a lot of danger, a lot of physical danger, and girding our loins and holding ourselves tight and closing ourselves down to danger was the way our system was designed. Fast forward now a whole bunch of years later, and we're still doing that, even when there are no saber-toothed tigers necessarily running after us. We still have those fears, and we transference is a psychological process that we do when we can't really deal with the thing directly, and we turn it into something else that we find more manageable or more familiar or something we understand. But what happens in this case, if somebody breaks our heart, we treat them like a saber-toothed tiger trying to puncture us. We shut ourselves down, we close ourselves off, and we kind of defend ourselves in ways that, interestingly enough, actually embed the pain. Think about it. We squeeze ourselves and make ourselves tight to protect ourselves. And what that does is hurt ourselves and actually hide and suffocate the pain within us and keep that pain from being able to heal. Pema Chodron likes to talk about the fact that you could look at the heart center metaphorically, of course, but let's look at it as though it actually holds our love and compassion and our kindness and our connectivity, and that's how we could see the world. That's how we could really connect to the world and be part of the world through those eyes, if we wanted to. But because we're afraid, we sort of more habitually look through the eyes of that fear, defensiveness. We look through the eyes of being frightened, and we do weird things with that. We make everything litigious. We make everything, a contract. We make everything have to mean one thing or another thing. And we rarely are straightforward because we're so conscious of trying to constantly protect ourselves. And what Pema says is that this heart center has been wounded, not through any fault of anyone in particular, but just being human. It is the kind of way it is. If there's pain, that's part of being human. The pain of birth, the pain of growth, the pain of separating so that you can redevelop it into something else. the pain of leaving the things that really it's time for them to go, right? And yet it's still sad, it's still painful. But this kind of pain is not only necessary, it's common to all human beings. But Pema says it's like we have that pain, it's like a wound in our heart. And rather than express it or open it or discuss it or be one with it, we hide it. And because we hide it, we close it off from the world and from ourselves. And when you hide a wound and you cover a wound up, you help it immediately. That's the initial way to deal with a wound, perhaps. But at some point, you have to take the bandages off. And at some point, you have to open the wound up, very much like the process we discussed with the cocoon. That at some point, you need to come out of the cocoon or the whole thing becomes quite rancid, quite toxic. Well, same thing happens with the wound. If you don't uncover it, don't let it breathe, it starts to really fester. And then when our wounds fester, which safe to say a lot of us have these wounds that have never healed because they've never seen the light of day, but we feel the sensitivity of that. We feel frightened for that. So it's like having a bruise and you're afraid of bumping into things, afraid of opening your heart because you've got this open wound that's really never healed. And then on top of it, we build stories around this because we're human. That's what we do. We build stories. So my wound has got to be super important because why would it not be if it's hurt me so badly? If I'm so frightened of it, it must be imbued with kind of great power, darkness. My heart is more damaged, or my heart is more unlovable, or I feel more disconnected. And we start to make ourselves very independent from the very thing that could cure us and heal us, which is community. We start to isolate. That isolation is implicated in a lot of stuff, from drug addiction, alcoholism, to lots of mental illness. Isolation is a way to fester the wounds within us, as opposed to communication, which is actually an unfolding and an opening and a healing. It's really hard to maintain mental illness when you're connected to a sane community around you. And eventually we start to shift and change our point of view because we have people that are supportive and people that are connected. But not all of us have that, and not all of us have that all the time. And all of us have a tendency to hide from that when we feel really wounded and hurt, because what we want to do is the very last thing we actually should do is we feel embarrassed and want to hide. We want to pull away inside ourselves. And to some extent, some of us do this really unconsciously. We just have huge parts of our psychology that we're not going to touch. So we just have this world that's, about this big, and things we could do. There's a saying that I have, which is tension in the body creates shadows in the mind, which create limitations in our life. And there's an interplay between these three things. I don't know where the chicken and the egg is in this. It might be the limitations in our life create these problems in our head that we store in our body, or the other way around. But I feel like it's embedded pain in our body that keeps us frightened of going certain places in our mind, that keeps our world from being limited and kind of shut down in the, in a weird sense, so to speak. I'm still, here we are. So I wanted to suggest, in a very practical sense, that we look into, perhaps study a little bit, the three kinds of pain, sometimes suffering. But what I want to do is parcel out pain from suffering to make it sort of easier and simpler to discuss. Does that make sense? And this is just, well, I'm not the only person that does it this way, but I mean, this is just a construct. It's not academia, and it's not the Buddhist, orthodox view necessarily or anything like that, but it's just a sense that if you look at pain as being all the necessary unpleasantness of life, and suffering as the unnecessary complications that we create around it, we actually could see that some of the suffering in our life has to do with growing, and it has to do with becoming, and it has to do with allowing ourselves to leave that cocoon or that cage in our heart and actually let ourselves begin to fly a little bit, just let ourselves come out and meet the sunshine and be part of life, that part of us that we've been hiding, And I don't think you have to do it all at once and ransack everything. I think it's just making a habit to try to push back a little bit on the, cocoon, and give yourself a little more space as your life unfolds. As opposed to the way a lot of people do, really, as they get older, they become more rigid, they become more mentally calcified, they become more subdued, they become darker and more closed in. It's really the work of a meditator to become more and more open, and to not use the excuse of arthritis or tiredness or sleepiness or our bank account to keep ourselves from really opening up and living a joyous and free life. It's really up to us. If we put our mind into the place where we just see the problems, then our world becomes based around that. If we can somehow turn our mind to how brilliant it is to just even have a mind or have a life, and see the sort of beauty in that, then even the pain becomes workable, because we're not making more suffering out of it. If, on the other hand, there's some pain that all of us go through, and yet you need to take it personally, well, as I do frequently, and then make a whole story about it and make that story have blame, and blame is a beautiful way not to look at ourselves. When we blame others, we're not looking at the only thing we could change about the situation we don't like, which is ourselves. And the only way we can really look at ourselves is through eyes of love. Otherwise, we will resist it. We will push ourselves away. We have to really, I believe, learn to love ourselves enough to be able to check in and go, dude, you're really scared by this. You're really thrown here. And sort of get a sense of, I don't know, how you are, how you behave. And we begin to know ourselves. And it's that knowing ourselves that actually, I don't know, gives us a certain power. Power of familiarity is what it's called in the meditative tradition. The three kinds of suffering are the suffering of not getting what you want or getting what you want. Because both of those are suffering, because if you have what you want, you're going to lose it. And if you don't have what you want, you're suffering. And then there's the pain of alternation, the pain that nothing stays the same. It's always changing, it's shifting. It doesn't really ever become manageable to where we can control things, right? Things we want are always out of our grasp. It's they say very much the characteristic of the human realm, of the six realms. We're in the human realm. And that realm is very challenging, very painful, because we can see so much, we want so much, and yet we have so little time and ability. So the antidote is to rest in our heart, accept ourselves, want less, and accept more. Does that make sense? And then that might open up that third kind of suffering, which is this all pervasive suffering, this basic sense of anxiety that we have in the human realm. And people keep trying to medicate it, get rid of it and throw it out. But the Buddha 2,500 years ago talked about this, and it was existent then for millennia, supposedly. You know, he wasn't inventing something. He was looking at human experience, and the human experience is that we're constantly, you know, constantly having this pain of not getting what we want. We're constantly experiencing the pain of things changing and leaving us. We're constantly feeling this feeling of anxiety inside. And all of those things are absolutely part of being human. They're what we have to work with. Problem happens when we don't want those things, or we misinterpret those things and believe that there's some problem or something wrong with me. And that's the usual interpretation. I've screwed up somehow. That's why I have that anxiety. I've screwed up. That's why this person left me. I screwed up. That's why I can never get what I want. And we start beating ourselves up and compounding ourselves in compounding our suffering into this huge story that becomes our raison d'etre. It becomes who we are. We are suffering constantly with this job I can't stand. We're suffering constantly in this relationship I can't breathe anymore. We're constantly suffering in this body. I can't move around in the way I used to. Whatever it is, we create suffering from the pain that's very natural. If that makes sense. So when the Buddha talked about the Four Noble Truths, he talked about the fact that pain exists. It is part of our experience, but the cause of suffering is this believing that we can make it different, that we somehow are different than the rest of the world who's suffering, or not that we actually believe that, but we just don't, it's narcissistic. We just see it from our point of view. We're suffering like we're the only ones who ever suffered, and we take it all so personally. But the next noble truth is that there's a cessation to that. There is the possibility of a gap in that. And we've all experienced that. We've all experienced joy and balance and openness, kindness, and completeness in our lives. But that just somehow, by some trick of the logic of our brain, doesn't seem as real as the anxiety and the stress and the suffering that we create around the very natural pain of our life. So somehow that openness and that kindness, that completeness, that surrender to just what is, that is so beautiful, and that we've all experienced. Maybe it's got to be on a golf course, or maybe it's after a martini, or maybe it's when somebody is holding you. You know, maybe we have all these conditions to get to that point. But that point is there, regardless of the conditions. That point is as real as all of the anxiety. And if we start to turn our mind toward that, we start to pull our mind out of that cage and allow ourselves to be able to just be vulnerable and free and silly and stupid and not perfect, and maybe get our heart broken. And I'm not saying to be unkind to ourselves and just, rip ourselves open, but to actually gradually open more and more in our lives and allow the world to see more and more of the things that we feel like we have to hide. There's some kind of satisfaction in pulling something off on the world, like you get away with something, but it's nothing compared to the satisfaction in having people love you for who you are. I'll finish with a little story, and it's a very short one. But I was a comedian in Manhattan, and I had issues with drugs and temperament, certain things. And I was driving myself crazy. And when I found meditation, decided to just leave everything in this dramatic sense, this flurry. And I moved to a mountain retreat center. And I lived in the retreat center. But you could take the boy out of New York, but you can't take New York out of the boy. And I wouldn't stop telling my stories. I wouldn't stop, doing my bits and my routines. I would basically drive people crazy. And I told a friend of mine, I said, I don't know what it is. People are so nice to me, but nobody really wants to hear any of my stories. Nobody really gives a damn about who I am. When I try to share, nobody really wants to hear it. And he looked at me and he said, Joe, people love you. He said, they love you in spite of your bullshit, not because of it. That nailed it. I was like, oh, that's it. There's something inside here that I'm covering up with all that bullshit. And the people in that meditation community could see it because they were trained to see that way. They weren't believing the stories necessarily. Lucky me for that. That was really good.